Thank you, Noam Chomsky, for this interview.
Please. I'm very pleased to be with you.
Me too. It's a very beautiful space here in Tucson. For me, it's the first time in America. First time.
Really?
I'm very happy. I'm studied your theories when I was.
Thanks.
Would you like some water?
No, thank you. When I was young, and you for me was always an example. In Italy, I'm working about conference. The question is the relationship between science and faith. The component rationality and irrationality in man, no? The passion and the technique. No? Today, in our world, the technique have a power of technique. Is also possible speak about harmonizate the religion and the technique, or is impossible this relationship?
That's. I don't think that that's a general intellectual question. It's a personal question. I mean, individuals can, in various ways, relate religious faith, if they have it, to scientific, to the progress of science. That goes back as far as Augustine, how to relate your faith to the world of science, a huge issue. And for some people, like me, the question doesn't arise because I don't have religious faith. That doesn't mean that there's not an irrational component. I think we have to distinguish two things. Irrational components in our ways of organizing our lives, our scientific work, and so on. And that's distinct from faith in, say, one of the Abrahamic religions. That's a different matter. You can have one without the other. But there is some kind of substantial irrational component that enters into our actions, our decisions, even our scientific work. That's not disputable. My favorite philosopher, David Hume, is famous for having said that reason is the slave of the passions. It means it can't function without your emotional, instinctive, intuitive conceptions of how the world works. And that's true even of the most elementary perceptions. Like when I look at you, I see a person. Well, why do I see a person? Actually, what's happening, if you look at my eyeball, is just a series of random stimulations going on. But out of that, I construct a person. That's part of my nature. That's the way I'm built. And elements like that enter into all of our experiences of the world and all of our interpretations of the world. That we can't avoid it. We can try to discover what the factors are, maybe even find ways to overcome them. But that's just the way we're built. So, for example, when you take the famous moon illusion, if you look at the rising moon, when it's on the horizon, the moon looks very large. As it moves up into the sky, it seems to get smaller. Well, you can't overcome that. You can't help seeing that the moon looks bigger at the horizon. But you can study it from another perspective and point of view and discover why it is that you're getting this illusion that distorts the physical reality. Sometimes there are things we just can't discover. They're too deep. But at every stage of our, and I think faith, if you want to call it that, is just one further aspect of what we find when we begin by looking at the most elementary experience and then on through our interpretations of it to much more complex and abstract conclusions about justice, honesty, freedom, and so on.
There are in the humanity a universal component in humanity, no? For example, in your theory of linguistic theory, the language have a specific component, universal component. Correct me if I'm wrong.
It seems to be the case that language is a kind of a species property of humans, meaning it's common to all humans, and it's unique in its fundamental aspects, so we don't see any close analog in any other organism. So in that sense, it's a species property. But we now know a fair amount about this, so it's pretty well established by now that humans, all humans, come from a pretty small group in Africa. They began to separate about 150,000 years ago, and as far as we know, all humans everywhere share the same language capacity and probably the same cognitive systems.
But the origin of this difference, which is the origin of the difference of linguistic African Europe, when is and why is this scission?
What? I'm sorry?
Why the humanity don't use the same language?
Why don't we speak? Well, we actually do, I think. If you take a look on the surface, it looks as if languages are very different. But when you begin to study them in depth, you find that as you go farther and farther into the internal nature of the language, they're pretty much modeled on the same, cast to the same mold. It's the same with organisms. You take a look at all the organisms in the world, they look very different from one another. You know, ants, locusts, sheep, humans, like every possible thing could be an organism. And in fact, that was believed about 60 or 70 years ago. It's now known that all organisms are remarkably similar in their basic nature. They really haven't. They all are fundamentally on the same form. The forms that were established, for one thing, we all have the same cells, same kind of cells. You take the cells of, say, yeast, the most primitive thing, and humans. You and I couldn't tell the difference between them. You have to be an expert to see the differences between them. And if you look at body forms, it turns out they were all pretty much established about 500 million years ago when the so-called Cambrian explosion. Haven't changed very much. So the variety on the surface looks very different. Begin to penetrate into how the system works, and you find remarkable similarities, what's called very deep conservation of fundamental properties. And anything you don't understand looks very complex. The more you begin to understand it, the more you find that there are simple rules and principles that determine it, which vary around the surface, at the edges, but at the core are pretty much the same.
Question very deep and important for me is the question of time, philosophic question. The time in philosophy are different answers. For example, Darwinism is a typical answer about the question of time. In one of my philosophic book, the name is History as Living Organism, I image the time not as a line, not as a circle, but as a organism, no? Relation from different time in the world. My answer for you is the millenary question of time, no? Everything change, or are there something in humanity that not change?
Well, as I say, with
It's a deep
first of all,
question.
humans, from the point of view of the history of the universe, the humans are just an instant. Our whole existence is a tiny instance in the history of the universe. If some accident had taken place, if an asteroid had hit the Earth 200,000 years ago, there wouldn't be any humans. We're just a very recent development, emergence in the history of the universe, and our whole existence, from the point of view of a cosmic creature looking at us, would be almost invisible. So we're a speck. We're a tiny speck in the universe and in the time that the universe is developed. And we may not exist very long. I mean, we're actually facing a period where humans might destroy themselves within a short period of time. So in terms of eternal history, we may just look like a tiny accident that happened quickly and then was extinguished. We may not like to think of ourselves that way, but that's what we are. And so we're not the center of the universe by any means. In fact, intelligent life altogether is very rare. It almost never exists. Conditions for it exist, but it never emerges. Maybe because when it emerges, it just destroys itself.
No, thank you again for this meeting. I'm very honored to
Wonderful to talk to you.
be here. Thank you.